Welcome everyone to 1982 edition. We are sporting our nephew's gift for Carnival. The wig part, not the glasses part. I don't think he has the pocket money for that. What we're going for today is going over the current state of Mythic Plus Dungeons, especially after yesterday's round of quite hefty nerfs given to the dungeons, as well as taking a look at the moment at what are the most run dungeons, the most sought after dungeons, and of course the loot inside those dungeons, and also the current key levels of the dungeons, the current difficulty of each dungeons, which one are at the moment considered by the player base, looking at basically the amount of depletes, the amount of runs in each dungeon, and I guess the difficulty of each dungeon so far at the beginning of Season 2. The most important part, of course, was not just the nerfs to the dungeons, but the global nerf put by Blizzard. As Blizzard is saying, we have broadly reduced the difficulty of Mythic and Mythic Plus dungeons. As a result, we are lowering the health and damage of all enemies by 10% across Mythic 0 and Mythic Plus. So on top of this minus 10% health and damage nerf, we've also gotten multiple nerfs to multiple dungeons. Now, some dungeons got away for free because Workshop has been dodging any nerfs. Also, the Rookery has been given no nerfs. Theater of Pain has been given no nerfs, and also Dark Flame Cleft has been given no nerf, besides the bug fix that you could line of sight the first boss's charge, which is not. It looks smart at first, but it's not something you want to do because you want to use the charge to get rid of the 50 million adds in the fight, and the charge is gonna kill them, so you didn't want to line of sight the charge anyways. So besides these 4 dungeons being completely left alone, which is interesting because at the moment, out of these 4 dungeons, not really changed significantly. You do have the Rookery, which is one of the easier dungeons, so it makes sense not to change it. Theater of Pain has also been considered one of the easier dungeons, not being changed, also makes sense. Cleft and Workshop are kind of the halfway through, the middle of the pack in terms of dungeon difficulty. I would say the Rookery is pretty fine, besides the casters spamming their lightning bolts in the first big room of the first boss, which can be quite nasty if you lack some of the interrupts in your group, as well as more likely Dark Flame Cleft. The first part of the dungeon is really problematic before the first boss because of the insane damage of the mole rats throwing rocks to enemies, chunking them for half of their HP, getting enraged and spamming their throw rocks even faster, killing players very quickly. Yes, technically speaking, if you stack on them, they are supposed to not be casting this throw rock if you are all in melee, which many players still don't know yet, number 1, and number 2, these enemies also leap away and it makes it harder for them to be grouped together, especially when you are pulling 2 packs and there is 2 of them and both of them jump in different directions. It gets pretty nasty for the especially the casters that get pelted by these rocks. That's perhaps the more annoying part of Dark Flame Cleft. Besides that, nothing actually too difficult in there, especially because of the timer being very lenient right now in Cleft. Also Workshop, at this point many players have known and run Workshop multiple times. At this point it has been nerfed enough times that there aren't really that many really dangerous or really annoying parts in the dungeons anymore, so it's kind of okay. Now, as for the actually nerfed dungeons, interesting that the easiest of the dungeons, the Motherlode, right now is the one that has the highest average mean rating of 227 in the runs, which means, the average key being completed in Motherlode is higher than the others. It's still being nerfed. Motherlode, despite being considered the easier one, has gotten a bunch of nerfs. First of all, the crawler mine health was reduced, and the speed also was being reduced to make it easier to kite the mine around. It gets pretty annoying, especially when you're pulling the big mechs with their AoE and you're supposed to be healing, but you are a healer with a mine on top of you and you have to run while you have to AoE heal. That was the most dangerous part of that last run to the last boss with these mines. And then one of the nastier, one of the more dangerous pulls right after the first boss, the Azerite extractors. You had to pull at least 2 of them, minimum maybe 3 of them, and you know, they were dangerous partially because of their damage and partially because of the, you know, not very careful players eventually ninja pulling as they try to dodge all of the circles on the ground. That was probably even higher, an even higher cause of wipes in that area. The ninja pulling, the ass pulling of other packs while you're trying to dodge. The damage was nerfed of this AoE by 25%, and then a more confusing nerf, the last boss's Gatling gun damage was nerfed by 50%. The reason why it's confusing is because you're not supposed to be hit by this Gatling gun damage in the first place. So why would you want to nerf the damage of a mechanic you're not supposed to be hit by? That's kind of weird. So to be fair, sure, still not that many nerfs for the Motherlode, which is still considered the easier of the dungeons. However, why don't we go the opposite way? There was the hardest dungeon, which is still after these changes, because these changes went live yesterday, and it is still considered the harder dungeon overall, which is Floodgate. Now, Floodgate is the harder dungeon and also at the moment the second least run dungeon in Mythic Plus. Maybe because it's new. Actually, maybe it's a bit weird considering it's new, so it's one of the things you haven't tried yet, but it's not really being run as much as the others. Now, possibly because it was the hardest, justified nerfs have come the way of Floodgate. Perhaps the more enjoyable of the nerfs, especially for healers, has been the nerf of the, I guess, the third boss, the Guardian that you summon before entering the last boss's segment of the dungeon. Awaken the Swamp. So the waves caused by the mechanics are now going to be 25% slower. So it's basically easier to dodge all of the waves. That was kind of the annoyance, not just the waves, but the fact that you were tied to another player while you had to dodge them, while you also had to heal, of course, and forecasters continue to try to do damage while you were constantly on the move. That was quite the annoying part of this fight, which goes on and on and on, and it's always the same. It was quite a difficult part of the dungeon. A couple of good QOLs like the Dark Fuse Inspectors jumping around constantly, less often, since their cooldown of Surprise Inspection was reduced by 2 seconds. Other reasonable QOLs here and there, Sludge Claws doing less damage, Mudslide being on a longer cast time, whatever. The Tank Buster of the last boss, this is a tank, you know, this is a tank relief. The Tank Buster, the Thunder Punch on the last boss has been nerfed in physical damage by 15%. I have seen some tanks having a lot of trouble dealing with this heavy Tank Buster mechanic on the last boss. These are the nerfs given to the Floodgate. You know, overall, despite showing up as the hardest of the dungeons and the least run of the dungeons, it didn't seem too bad after these nerfs. Some of the trash packs are somewhat annoying, but not that frustrating. Even the bosses, you know, the first boss is reasonable, the second boss is pretty fun to deal with the charges. The Dispel, sure, the Dispel can be pretty tricky if the players have been ticked down in HP, they're not aware of the amount of damage that the kinetic gel explosion does on them, and when they get Dispelled can be a bit dangerous, but overall it seemed pretty decent after these nerfs. We will see if the players' perception in the community will also improve on this dungeon and more will start running Floodgate after these nerfs. The third dungeon in set of nerfs, which are not as many, it's Cinderbrew Meadery. So Meadery is considered on the bottom end in terms of difficulty, possibly because it is being run so much. We will talk about this, about the gear being chased in these dungeons, but Meadery right now is in the top half of dungeons being run, attempts at the dungeon being completed, and as a result it is also the second worst dungeon in terms of completion, in terms of keys being completed in there, keys being finished in time in Meadery. So possibly one of the more dangerous parts across all of Meadery is the first few pulls, basically the entire zone on the first boss room, between the dots of the Pyromancer, the channel you need to interrupt of the Pyromancer, the ticking dot of the tags, you know, a lot of damage a lot of single target heavy damage besides just the AoE of the ticking damage on top, which gets pretty nasty. The tanks get destroyed and in this first room, and then you even have the boss. The double dot of the first boss is very, very dangerous. It's very, very deadly. It gets pretty difficult to survive. So it's interesting to see that when you look at Meadery, the nerfs given to Meadery were only to the second boss, IPA, which I guess puns intended is supposed to be IPA, being that it's a beer boss. The Spouting Stout AoE damage was nerfed by 33%, which is interesting considering it didn't seem like that difficult of an AoE to begin with, and it was way more difficult to deal with the odds running around, or the double dot given to players. And then the brew drops, the mobs that you need to cleave and kill before they reach the boss, have had 18% lower health and 14% lower speed. That's much more relevant of a nerf on this second or third boss of the dungeon. In the first room that we just mentioned being so problematic, only the intermission AoE damage to the party has been nerfed by 33%. That's it. So no changes to the actual trash mobs in the first room or to the, for example, double dot cast by the boss in this first zone of Meadery. So I do believe it's going to continue to be quite the nasty place. And even the route going from there to the B boss, that side of the trash, is still quite nasty, and it has been untouched as well. So despite the nerfs, it still looks like it's going to be a more tricky kind of dungeon so far. Now, we have left for last by far the most brutalized by nerfs, which is interesting because despite being the most brutalized by nerf, it is still one of the 3 worst dungeons to run. After the aforementioned Floodgate and Meadery, there is Priory of the Sacred Flame being one of the 3 worst dungeons. Now, despite this, Priory is also the second most run dungeon, despite being the 3rd hardest dungeon. So there have been, of course, a whole lot of nerfs to basically all of the lieutenants' HP, which were massive HP sponges. All their health was reduced by 10%, and a few of the nasty mechanics there, especially the tank busters, the tank weakeners, like the Capitan Delcry, one of the 2 of the first boss encounter, has gotten the Pierce Armor damage over time bleed reduced by 25%, which is quite helpful for tanks which were getting battered by this first boss. So basically all of these mini bosses and the bosses themselves have gotten their health reduced, even the extra of the guard captain Suleiman having 30% less HP now. On top of, don't forget that all of this is coming on top of the already 10% HP and damage reduction to all Mythic Plus dungeon. So this is on top of those HP nerfs. So it's a very good set of nerfs to Priory. However, it is still basically only just to the mini bosses leading up to the first boss. It's not really changing anything in the trash. Pretty much everything around the trash in the first zone, which wasn't too, I mean, it was kind of bad, but not that much. And more importantly, once you are inside the actual Priory, the actual cathedral, with all the mobs there, like the light spawns, the channel, the nuke on one player, the multicast of like fireball volley, or things like the divine tolls of the paladins doing AoE damage, none of that is getting changed. It's just on the lieutenants and the first bosses in the first part of the Priory that has gotten nerfed in this change. It should still make the dungeon somewhat easier, but not perhaps nearly as much of what you wanted to see. This is what we have in terms of the nerfs for the dungeons. Now, talking about the popularity of the dungeons, of course, many of the players are running these dungeons for things like weapons, kind of, but more importantly for trinkets. Right? Because many of these dungeons' popularity comes from where the best in slot of each spec comes from in terms of trinkets. Now, admittedly, this season, the vast majority of the best in slot trinkets are going to be coming from the raid and not from Mythic Plus. So for the big main stat plus mastery plus extra free damage, of course, Eye of Kazan is even after 2 different sets of nerfs, it's still the best in slot trinket for the majority. For many specs, House of Cards, of course, the de facto trinket for all 90-second cooldown DPS specs and healers, and even some of the 2-minute cooldown specs still want to go for House of Cards as their 2-go cooldown. You then have the Gear Grinder spare keys for your 2-minute big baton of damage and nothing else. You have Moxie's Jug for your main stat and stacking crit. For casters, you have Junk Master's Mega Magnet for all of the agility users, and Z's Tag Hotline for your proc of your goons to do extra damage. All of these are amongst the best of the trinkets you want to go for, and they are all from the raid. But if there are some of the trinkets you want to go for in Mythic Plus, one of the reasons why the Rookery at the moment, we could say, is the most run dungeon is perhaps because a couple of the best in slot trinkets for specs, like the Entropic Scardring Core, so the 2 procs per minute of main stat proc with critical strike as a stat stick, is one of the better best in slot items right now for trinkets, and also because it has crit and main stat, it's for all specs needing crit. It's not limited to intellect or agility or strength, so everyone wanting to go for crit can go for this trinket from the Rookery. You have the Sigil of Algaric Concordance spawning the crossbowmen for extra free damage. It's also in the Rookery, and also a decent to good trinket for many specs, so that justifies the Rookery being one of the most run dungeons. It's also good, of course, that the Rookery at the moment is one of the easier dungeons as well, so they go hand in hand quite well. However, there are some outliers, because we mentioned, for example, Priory being one of the most run dungeons despite being one of the hardest ones. Well, that's because Priory has the signet of the Priory trinket. So this is a 2-minute cooldown. We mentioned the 90-second cooldown trinket of the House of Cards. This 2-minute is one of the premier trinkets for all 2-minute cooldown specs to use this trinket together with their cooldowns. So many players are currently running this dungeon to try to get the signet trinket. And obviously the signet of the Priory being agility, strength and intellect means that it's a possible option for every spec, DPS and even healers. So that is also one of the reasons why Priory is such in high demand to try to hunt for this trinket, despite the difficulty of the dungeon. You also have the second most run dungeon actually, which is Theater of Pain, another one of the easier side of dungeons, which drops the Soul-Letting Ruby. So you have the Priory, which gives you your 2-minute cooldown of your highest secondary stat, and then you have Theater of Pain with the Soul-Letting Ruby giving you a crit 2-minute cooldown stat boost, but of course it's only crit, and on top of that it's only for intellect users, so obviously it's less sought after than the Priory trinket anyways, but it is still one of the higher run dungeons. Theater of Pain is in part and thanks to this trinket right now. But it's interesting to know, or rather we can say it is nice to know, that this time around the sets of nerfs came very early. They were quite hefty for many dungeons. This came after already a series of nerfs in the PTR. In before the couple of weeks of the release of this season, we did have multiple sets of nerfs to many dungeons. So right now, it seems like Blizzard went the way of trying to make reaching +10s, reaching 655 item level rewards from Mythic Plus end of dungeon cash, as well as your Vault max item level reward. It seems like they tried to make sure that this time around it was an easier reach compared to before. You could get there more quickly, which is also ultimately quite nice, because don't forget that now that it's easier to get there, it's also going to be easier to reach the point where you can clear all 12s. All 12s, by the way, is now in the new season the benchmark, the stop point where you will no longer deplete keys below that level. So once you get all of your 12s done, every key you get, even if it's a 12 and you deplete it, it's gonna stay at 12. So nerfing the dungeons, making it easier to get to that point, it's also gonna be quite more helpful, quite more handy for most players. But For today, on this retro Sunday, this is all we can go over after having looked at the dungeons and experienced all of the dungeons in this last couple of days, at least at plus 10 level. It was a nice experience. I was much less triggered and frustrated by the difficulty of the dungeons like in previous seasons, I can confidently say. Some of the annoyances are still there, but this season doesn't seem to be nearly as annoying as the rest of the pain points in the first season of The War Within, but even seasons in Dragonflight. Think about pre-nerfs release of things like Ruby Life Pools. I'm just gonna stop there, for example. So, with this out of the way on this Sunday, we can now leave each other. We are starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, just for the record, to reassure everyone, no, I've not been a victim of domestic violence. I don't have any black eyes hiding under the glasses. Just making sure.